Okay, guys, this is our second Watergate slide. Let's finish the tale of Richard Nixon here. In the middle of all of this Watergate investigation and hearings and reports and all of that, they questioned the vice president and began to look into whether the vice president, a man named Spiro Agnew, great name in political U.S. history here anyway, Spiro Agnew was Nixon's vice president. They start to question whether Agnew was involved and what he knew. So in the middle of investigating him, it is discovered that Agnew has not been paying his taxes for quite a number of years. So Agnew will be forced to resign as vice president. So in the middle of dealing with all this, Nixon now has to find a new vice president and get him approved by the Senate. He will select a Michigan senator, a very well-respected, well-liked man, Gerald Ford, F-O-R-D. Gerald Ford will be named Nixon's new vice president. So that's how it works. If this president gets to choose you, and then the Senate confirms you, much like a cabinet post. Okay? Now, that's very important. So that's why we had to put it in there. Doesn't seem it, but it's going to be very important. Back to our Watergate tale here. It was discovered that in the middle of all of the testimony that was going on, that Nixon had installed in the Oval Office a tape recording machine, and that he had tapes of all meetings that had taken place in the Oval Office. These come to be known as the Oval Office tapes, or the White House tapes, but we'll call them the Oval Office tapes here. Nixon had planned, when he finished his 2 terms as president, to write his memoirs, and he wanted to be able to go back and refer to these meetings that he had when he was writing his books and so forth, so he wanted a recording of them. Great and wonderful. Unless you're planning on holding meetings where you authorize former spies to break into Democratic headquarters and bug their offices. You probably don't want a record of that meeting. But nobody ever turned off the machine. There were tapes of the meetings that Nixon had with the plumbers, where he told the plumbers to break in. And then after they got caught, there were records and tapes of meetings where Nixon told his aides to cover up the break-in, to deny any knowledge of the plumbers. Those are going to turn out to be what's known as the smoking gun evidence. You know, if you walk into a murder scene and there's somebody standing over a dead body with a gun and smoke coming out of it, they probably fired the gun. These tapes will be the smoking gun evidence for Nixon, the damning piece of evidence that will link him to Watergate. There you see the political cartoon, Nixon delivering his famous "I am not a crook" quote, holding the tapes there. When it is discovered that these tapes exist, a judge orders Nixon to turn over the tapes. He refuses. The judge takes it to a higher court. He refuses again. Nixon claims executive privilege, that these tapes would compromise national security, that the president needs to be able to meet with his advisors in complete anonymity and confidentiality, and he cannot hand over the tapes. An argument goes back and forth and back and forth. Eventually it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, national security aside, you have to hand over the tapes, Mr. President. So they do. And just about when the Congress is listening to the tapes, and just about when they're to get to a point where Nixon is going to say something to incriminate himself, the tapes go blank. And then the sound comes back on, and they listen a little while longer, and there's another gap. Okay? And then it gets to a really good point, and there is a mysterious 18.5-minute gap in the tapes. Nixon says something must have gone wrong with the machine, or his secretary screwed it up. No, the tapes had been erased. Nixon had ordered parts of the tapes erased before they were handed over to the investigators. So things begin to look worse and worse for him. Okay? This gets us up to now, we're at October 1973. We're now almost a year after Nixon is reelected. He's into his second term. And the Attorney General, Nixon ordered the Attorney General to fire the special prosecutor, a man named Archibald Cox, C-O-X. Cox had been named by Nixon as a special prosecutor to investigate Watergate, but apparently he was doing too good a job, and Nixon wanted to get rid of him. So Nixon ordered the Attorney General to fire Cox. The Attorney General refuses. So Nixon says, fine, you're gone. The Attorney General resigns. The assistant or deputy Attorney General steps up, becomes the new Attorney General. He too refuses to fire Cox, the special prosecutor, and resigns. Nixon finally finds somebody who will agree to fire the special prosecutor. So he names the new guy, a man named Robert Bork. You don't have to worry about that name. But he becomes the new Attorney General, mainly because he agrees to fire the special prosecutor. So eventually, 4 people will lose their jobs in one night in what comes to be known as the Saturday Night Massacre, as Nixon tries to get rid of people that are closing in on him. Okay. It is at that point that the Republican leadership comes to Nixon and says, look, you're guilty of sin, everybody knows it, even we can't support you any further. Impeachment hearings are going to begin, and you are going to be put on trial. Do the right thing and step down as president. So, on August 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon will become the first and only president, up to that point, to resign from office. August 9, 1974, Nixon resigns, almost 2 years after he's reelected. He was reelected in November of 72. We're now up to August 74. Nixon will resign. Here you see the famous photo boarding Marine One, the presidential helicopter that will take him to Air Force One to fly him back home in California, giving his famous peace sign, I am not a crook, and all of that. Now, here's where things get real interesting. Okay. Remember Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, had to resign. Yes. Okay. He appoints Gerald Ford, senator from Michigan, as his new vice president. Ford will now become the new president. When Nixon resigns, Ford becomes the new president, making him the only man in U.S. history to serve as both vice president and president while being elected to neither one. Remember, he becomes vice president when Agnew resigns. He becomes president when Nixon resigns. Ford is a likable enough guy, very, very nice guy, well respected in the Senate. He's probably most famously remembered for being played by Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live. Ford, in spite of the fact that he was an accomplished athlete, played football and baseball at the University of Michigan. He was a tailback from Michigan. He was drafted by into the NFL and Major League Baseball, both. But decided to go to law school, become a lawyer and a senator and so forth. But in spite of being a very accomplished athlete, he was also very clumsy. He tripped and fell a lot, and Chevy Chase famously portrayed him tripping and falling all the time on Saturday Night Live. You see the picture here, a very famous picture at the bottom. Ford coming down the steps of Air Force One. This is him on the ground there after he's fallen down the steps, and everybody picking him up. He would claim that, well, it's raining, the steps were slippery and wet. But his wife here, holding an umbrella and coming down in high heels, seemed to make it down the steps just fine. But there's President Ford on the ground, tripping and falling. So, good guy, but a nice enough guy, but always known for being clumsy, even though he's an accomplished athlete. It's very strange. Anyway, here's where things get real interesting. About 1 month after he becomes president, Gerald Ford will pardon Richard Nixon. He's about to go on trial. for obstruction of justice and perjury, lying to Congress, covering up an investigation and so forth. He's about to go on trial, and Gerald Ford will pardon Richard Nixon for any crimes he may or may have not committed regarding the Watergate scandal. So Nixon never does go to trial, never does go to jail, even though he's guilty of sin. All of his aides go to jail and do some time, but Nixon never does. Ford pardons him. Now, there is a theory out there that when Spiro Agnew resigned, Richard Nixon went to his friend in the Senate, because Nixon had been in Congress himself. He goes to Ford and says, "Hey, listen, Jerry, I got a deal for you. How'd you like to be vice president?" Ford said, "Sure, I'd love to be vice president." He said, "Okay, look." Nixon said, "Now this is just a theory. Can't prove it." But Nixon went to Ford and said, "Look, there's a good chance this Watergate thing here is going to get worse before it gets better. And I might have to resign at some point, which means you'd be president. So I'll tell you what, I'll get you named vice president if you agree to pardon me if I have to resign." Not saying it happened, not saying it didn't. It's just a coincidence that about a month after taking office, one of Ford's first major actions is to pardon Richard Nixon. Maybe there was a deal worked out ahead of time. Maybe not. Who knows? But it makes for an interesting conspiracy theory there. Now, the last thing here, in sort of the ultimate of ironies, is that none of this had to happen. Richard Nixon was very popular in 1972. He was going to win re-election. He didn't need Watergate. He didn't need to break into Democratic headquarters. He didn't need to find out what their plans were. He would have won without all of this, and probably would have gone down in history as one of, maybe not top 10, but definitely top 15 presidents, in my opinion. All his environmental work, his foreign policy work, détente, China, the Soviet Union, triangular diplomacy, all of that. He would have been remembered as a really good president. Now all he's remembered for is Watergate. And the irony is, he didn't need it. He was going to win anyway. But remember what we started with. The paranoia, his enemies list, all of that comes back to haunt him. So, there's my brief defense of Richard Nixon, guilty as he was. I think a lot of his accomplishments get lost in the scandal that is Watergate.